Canada's Veterans Ombudsman is telling us that while the federal government has made some progress over the years, veterans are still facing a lot of difficulties when it comes to getting some benefits and services to which they've been entitled. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that and the delays that have gone on that have marked some of the fights that our veterans have had over the years. I'm joined today by a Canadian veteran, Mike Lalonde, who is in Ottawa. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, tell me your story.
I'm a veteran. I served in the Canadian Army for 23 years, and I took on a couple of minor injuries, so I was medically discharged in May of 2017 and came out of the Army at that point. And while my situation was relatively easy for Veterans Affairs to process, I'm kind of that cookie-cutter template that the new Veterans Charter was built for. I know many veterans who have not had it nearly as well as I have, and they're still waiting for benefits. They've applied. We're looking at sometimes well over a year or more to hear back from Veterans Affairs. And the feeling that I'm getting is that there's very much a culture of an insurance adjudication program to make sure that a veteran doesn't get a single penny more than they ought to. And that's just not the right approach to take when you have a veteran that's reaching out for help and you're saying, well, wait a minute, we need to spend a year and a half to make sure that you're actually entitled to help. What happens to these people in that meantime? And it's just shameful, the delays that most people are going through.
Mike, it's not the process itself that you want to make sure that we're handing out the appropriate amount of money. It's the delay. Why so long for some cases, Mike? Because it seems that this should be fairly routine. If you were injured while you were in uniform and you need some benefits and you need some medical assistance, it sounds like it should be straightforward. So what's missing here?
Well, the missing part would be more resources into the approval process, but also eliminating a lot of the layers upon layers of approval. It used to be that case managers, had a certain degree of latitude and authority, and they still have a little bit now, but not nearly enough. And so everything's centralized. You basically got to fight through a big bureaucratic machine. And the other problems are mental health, right? So when you've got a soldier that's coming out of the military and they're suffering from mental health in any which way or form, they're not particularly well suited to doing lots of paperwork and dotting all their I's and crossing their T's and meeting deadlines and that sort of thing. And so what happens is people end up falling through the cracks too, and not necessarily through the fault of the system per se, but it's just a reality that we have failed to adapt to, because you've got these guys that are struggling and they're not in a good position to be able to get through that. And I know of countless instances where people fell through the cracks because of that. And then, of course, it takes even longer to try to accommodate that. So on the one hand, we have to streamline the approval process and make it not be so horrendously bureaucratic. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that we're going to have cases that are unique, or people aren't going to be able to do what the bureaucracy expects of them because they're suffering from some pretty special and unique needs.
Too many cuts or reductions in staff at Veterans Affairs? Is it as simple as that?
I couldn't tell you if they've reduced staff or not. I don't know what they've done internally with the staff, so I couldn't really comment on that. What I do know is that you have to wait far too long. And so is it a matter of they don't have enough staff to process, or is it a matter of the system being too onerous for the staff to process? And I would suggest to you it's probably a lot of both.
I know that at one time the veterans used to talk about what they felt was the no-go policy, which was just for the people at any of the federal offices, including Veterans Affairs, to just keep saying no until you went away, right? So keep no, and finally you go away. Is that still the sense that a lot of our veterans are getting?
I could tell you I personally did not have that experience. My experience was positive. I had no problems. But I do know of other people that are running into some difficulties, and I wouldn't call it such a straightforward as no, 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 but when we get into situations like the vocational rehabilitation program, which is something that all veterans are eligible for if they're medically discharged, this is something that includes an earnings loss benefit and potential re-education training and that sort of thing, which is a great program. The problem is that there seems to be a sense that they want to get you off that program fast and furiously and not take the time and money necessary to retrain people to have a good career. So case in point, you get somebody coming out of the military after, spending 10 plus or more years in there. You could be in your 30s and 40s. You've got a wife and kids. You've got a mortgage to pay. You've got bills to pay. And so now you're on this earning loss benefit, which is great, but you need to get retrained and re-educated in order to be able to go and get yourself a new job. And they brought in an education training benefit, which is great, but the problem is you're not eligible to receive that education benefit if you stay on what we call the voc rehab. So you'd have to get off the one program in order to get that education retraining. So now you'll have your tuition paid for, but you're not having the earnings loss benefit in there, which means that you're not able to pay your bills or your mortgage, right? So they've created some situations, or they've created some possible solutions, but it's not really a solution unless you can take part in both the earnings loss benefit and also the tuition training program. So those are problems that still arise because it just doesn't make any sense, right? If you were in your early 20s and you're a very young veteran, yeah, sure, that probably works out pretty well for you. But for older people that have more on their plates, it's just not a realistic solution.
Our Veterans Ombudsman, Guy Perron, is going to be on our afternoon show with Richard Cloutier and Christian Amell a little bit later on, and he can speak to some of the recommendations. But when only this is 10 years on, and only 46 out of the 64 recommendations have been implemented, that tells us that successive federal governments have been kind of dragging their heels a little bit on this, doesn't it, Mike? I mean, what other conclusion do you come to?
I mean, the conclusion that I would say is that electorally across the board, veterans issues have just not been a priority. When the issue comes to light in the news, there's a lot of attention that gets brought to it, or there's outcry, and it starts to matter, but once a new news cycle develops, a lot of these issues become forgotten about. And so the only way that that's going to change is if, A, we get more veterans elected to Parliament, which is why I'm throwing my hat in the ring, but B, the Canadian public has to keep pressing this issue on a full-time basis, not just when a story pops in the news, because all of our politicians are vote-seeking creatures, right? And so if the Canadian public makes it clear that this is a priority to them, it will indeed become a priority to their politicians. And so to some extent, I think that if you want to point fingers, there's a lot of places that you can point fingers at, and we need to come together as a society and recognize our patriotic duty to look after veterans. We need to move beyond finger pointing at this point and work together to do this, because this is something that shouldn't be bipartisan, or partisan rather. It shouldn't fall to the left or to the right. This is a Canadian issue that we all have to take seriously, and I'm very sad to say that it's not something that we have all taken seriously enough in the past, and that's why we are where we are today.
Right, and I know that it's easy to blame the current government, and the Conservative, the opposition is pointing the finger at the current government, but it's tough for them to do that, isn't it, Mike? Because, I mean, after all, these guys were in power for 9 years, and these problems still persisted under them too. So, as you said, successive Canadian governments have been equally inactive on this file.
Well, I think, the biggest difference that we're seeing right now is the complete and utter lack of respect for our veterans paid by the Prime Minister. So to give you a perfect example, when he did his town hall tour earlier in the year, we had a Canadian war hero confront him and look him in the eye and say that, hey, listen, I was prepared to lose my life. I was prepared to lose my limbs. and I was prepared to sacrifice for my country, but what I wasn't prepared for is for my country to turn my back on me. And Justin Trudeau's response was, and he looked him in the eye and he said, I'm sorry, but you guys are asking for more than we're able to give. He literally said, you're asking for more than we're able to give. And he says that at the same time he's got $4.5 billion to pull out of thin air to pay for a pipeline that somebody else was perfectly willing to build for free. And it's that type of hypocrisy, and it's that type of lack of respect that's really got veterans upset. No one can hold hand over heart and say every government's done a perfect job on this. But what I can tell you from my perspective and from many veterans' perspectives is that the former Conservative government was never disrespectful like this towards our veterans, not ever once. And
well, wait a sec. That's not fair, because you guys had to go to court to try to get your benefits. You had to fight with the Harper government in court to try to get benefits. So, I mean, I don't know how you can say they didn't disrespect vets. It's
not... Obviously, the way they chose to deal with that, I don't think was the greatest, right? No government can claim that they have done a perfect job on the veterans file, and you'll get no disagreement from me there. But what you didn't have is Stephen Harper going, live on air and saying something like that to a veteran. And what that does is it shows you the mindset of your national leader. It shows you, what he cares about and what he doesn't care about. And if you've got a leader like that that's saying those types of things, how can you ever feel like that government is going to make a priority? So again, it's not to say that past governments have been perfect, because they haven't, but I'm not aware of a situation where any government has demonstrated that complete and utter lack of disregard.
Well, you might want to talk to some of those guys who dealt with Julian Fantino when he was the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and the kind of disrespect that he showed the veterans. Now, Harper didn't say those things, but his minister sure did.
No, he didn't say those.
Well, he didn't say that. He didn't say them outright. But I mean, it's the lack of respect. What I'm saying is that I don't know if anybody is in any position to say we have stood up for veterans, because I don't think there's any evidence that any Canadian government has or will.
And again, like I said, I'll tell you, I don't think that we have done a good enough job on this on either front. Regardless of who's been in power, you'll get no arguments from me there, none whatsoever. But what I will say is that that lack of disrespect that Justin Trudeau showed hurt us all. I mean, that's just not something that you want to hear
right
while you're trying to fight for benefits. When you're struggling with mental health issues, when you don't have a leg, when you can't find a job, when your family's falling apart and you're hurting everybody around you, you don't need to hear your prime minister saying, I'm sorry, but you're asking for too much. What would have happened if throughout our history, when our soldiers were sent to war off on various missions throughout First World War, Second World War, the Korean War, peacekeeping, Afghanistan, and the like, what would have happened if any of our soldiers, who are now veterans now, but at the time, what would have happened if they would have turned around and said, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but you're asking for too much. You're asking for more than I'm able to give. That's not something a veteran would have ever said, and therefore it follows that no Canadian Prime Minister should ever say something like that to a veteran. And I can tell you I'm not alone in feeling that way. When you say something like that, it's really, really tough to get that warm and fuzzy and say, yeah, gee whiz, our government's looking after us, because, when he said that, he just proved that this just wasn't a priority, and that hurt everybody a lot.
Mike Lalonde, thanks for this, and thank you for your service to our country.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Mike Lalonde is a Canadian veteran, and he spoke to us today from Ottawa.